So I essentially bought this flat without actually seeing it, which I wouldn't advise, but in hindsight, it was a great decision. What's going on, people? Welcome back to my channel. For those who are new, my name is Jamie and I talk about property, investing and personal finance. But today I'm going to be talking about shared ownership. A lot of people don't really understand shared ownership, and there's been a lot of bad press about shared ownership, particularly from people who are not involved in it and don't really understand it. So I want to be giving you today my experiences of shared ownership, some of the pros and cons of the shared ownership initiative. Now, before we get started, if you're enjoying these videos, drop me a like, drop me a comment, even subscribe and press that little bell thingy to get those notifications for when I upload new content, All your support is really appreciated. So, firstly, what is shared ownership? Shared ownership is part of the government's Help to Buy initiatives to provide affordable housing for first-time buyers. Essentially, it allows the buyer to buy a portion of a property where they pay a mortgage, typically starts at around 25%, and then the remaining share, they will pay rent to the housing association? To the housing association. To be eligible for the shared ownership initiative, you must be at least 18 years old. You must have a combined household income of £80,000 or less, or in London, £90,000. And it is for people who don't own another property and cannot afford a suitable home for their housing needs on the open market. Right, so let's have a look at some of the pros and cons of shared ownership, starting with the pros. And the first one which I want to discuss is that it makes it easier for first-time buyers to get on that property ladder with a minimum 5% deposit. Now, shared ownership or no shared ownership, a 5% deposit is incredible no matter how you look at it. And if you have limited funds and limited savings, this will allow you to get your first step into the property ladder with shared ownership. The second pro is the combined cost of shared ownership is generally cheaper than if you were to rent. And I'm not a big fan of renting. Essentially, you're paying someone else's mortgage. It's dead money. Whereas with shared ownership, at least you're building up your equity in the property, which will eventually give you enough money to then move on and buy a property outright. Another pro for me is that generally shared ownership buildings are new builds. And when you're moving into a flat and it's fresh, everything's new, you just have a better feel to it. And that was just my preference when I was looking at shared ownership. Having a new flat where no one's lived in, I can put my own stamp on it, having something that I own, I really, really like that. So that might not be for you, but for me, that was a pro and a positive of shared ownership. And lastly, staircasing. So once you get on that property ladder, you've got your let's say 25% share in a property, you have the ability to increase that share to 100% if you wanted to. You could increase it gradually over time from 25 to 60%, all the way up to 100%, where you then become the owner of that property. And this is called staircasing. And you could argue that staircasing could be a con as well, which I'm going to discuss in a minute. But essentially, you have the right to purchase more shares in the property. Also, before we move on to the cons, I just want to quickly touch on stamp duty, because we all know stamp duty is ridiculous. I hate stamp duty. We all hate stamp duty. But with shared ownership, you have the opportunity to defer your stamp duty payment until you staircase to that 80% threshold. So if you purchase a property at 25% share and you plan to not staircase, that's great. However, if your plan is to increase to 100%, you must be aware when you hit that 80% threshold, you have to pay stamp duty tax. And what people don't know is that stamp duty tax is not the price of which you originally purchased the property, but it's the price at which it currently is in the current market value. So essentially, you're deferring your tax payment to a later date. However, that has the potential to be a bigger stamp duty cost because the property may have increased in value over time. So moving on to the cons, and as I mentioned, staircasing is a little bit of blurred lines. It is a pro in some sense, but it's also a con in others. And one of the cons is if you do staircase to, let's say, moving from 25% to a 75% share, then you may find it difficult to sell your property when you come to move on. Essentially, the housing association has first refusal to buy your property back. If they don't want to buy it, then it goes onto the open market. And what we generally know about shared ownership is that it's there for people who cannot afford to buy using other schemes like Help to Buy or buying outright. So if they have an option of buying a 75% share, they might not be able to afford that. So the pool of applicants who could potentially buy your property at 75% rapidly decreases. So you just need to be aware of that and be aware of your exit strategy when it comes to staircasing. Also, another con of staircasing is that you are essentially increasing your share in the current market value. So let's say, use an example again, you have 25% share in a property, and 5 years down the line, you want to increase your share to 50%, but the actual value of the property has increased over time. And that means that you're purchasing your additional shares in the property at a higher value. There are also some additional costs when it comes to shared ownership. So you have to pay ground rent and service charge, which is generally just maintenance for the building. And ground rent is basically what the property, the land in which the property sits on. You have to pay that. And that is fixed. So if you do staircase, that price remains the same over time, but however, it could increase. So it's not going to drop, but it could increase over time, depending on the housing association and how much it does actually cost to maintain the building. There's also limited mortgage products available for shared ownership, and because there's a limited pool of mortgage products, then generally the interest rates are a lot higher than your standard residential mortgage. So do be aware that the interest rates are going to be higher, and that essentially you're going to be paying back more money with a shared ownership scheme. Subletting is a no-no as well. You're not allowed to rent out an additional room in a shared ownership property. And being a shared ownership owner, you have all the responsibilities of a homeowner. So if anything goes wrong in the flat, in the house, you are responsible for fixing it. And lastly, the final con is you have to be eligible, and there are certain priority lists which you may not be aware of with shared ownership schemes. So some boroughs might want you to either live or work in the area to be accepted onto the shared ownership scheme. Others might have a priority list of, let's say, nurses or military personnel to be accepted on the priority list. So you may find a little bit of difficulty actually being accepted for shared ownership. So in terms of my experience with shared ownership, about 5 years ago now, I was living back home in Nottingham and doing the whole long distance relationship with my girlfriend who was based in London, and we decided to kind of move in together. So she was down in London, I was back home, so she was doing all the heavy lifting when it came to looking at potential places to live. We looked at various different renting opportunities, and generally the kind of places that we could afford to live in weren't nice, and we were spending a lot of money for a small tiny flat, which is not very nice. In not very nice neighborhoods either. So we really wanted to make the very most of our money, which we had. We didn't have a lot of money. We had some savings. We didn't have the bank of mum and dad to fall back on. So shared ownership for us at the time was the best opportunity, and that's why I'm a big fan of it, because it's given us the platform to actually get on the property ladder and start building out equity in the property so that we can eventually move on and buy another property outright. So I'm really thankful for shared ownership. So as I mentioned, my girlfriend was looking at all different types of flats around London, and finally came to kind of shared ownership. And we was looking at the scheme and the different flats available, and we found it really difficult to actually be accepted onto the scheme because we didn't live in the borough, we didn't work in the borough, and they had, like I said, a lot of priority lists, which we were at the very bottom of it. So we find it really difficult, but at this point we decided that this is the route for us. We wanted to go down this route, and then we finally found a property, this property, 1-bedroom flat in Zone 3, Southeast London, and there was no priority list for this one. So essentially she viewed it without me, and she basically said that this flat's available, it's a first come first serve. If we want it, we need to put down a reserve on it, a deposit right now. So I essentially bought this flat without actually seeing it, which I wouldn't advise, but in hindsight, it was a great decision. So we put down our reserve payment, we spoke to our solicitors, we spoke to a mortgage broker, got a mortgage, put a deposit down. I think it was around £5,000. So like I said, a £5,000 deposit in London for a 1-bedroom flat in Zone 3 is an absolute bargain, especially if you're a first-time buyer and you have limited funds available. So yeah, that's how we got into shared ownership, and we've been here for the past 5 years now, and it's been going great. Like, we've been building our equity in the property, and eventually move on to kind of a bigger place, which we can hopefully own outright. And more recently, we've ventured into staircasing. So we've gone from owning 35% of the property to now owning 60% of the property. And with staircasing, as I said, it's pros and cons. It depends on how you look at it. And I'm fingers crossed, I'm hopeful it's a pro in the long run. But the cons of it, which we didn't know and consider at the time, is the additional cost of staircasing. So we had to remortgage, so we had to get a new mortgage, and that remortgage came with an additional deposit which you had to pay. So we wasn't expecting that, so we had to pay an additional deposit. And the solicitor fees involved in that were expensive as well. I think there was around £1,700. So I think in total we must have spent about 8 or 9 grand to staircase. But essentially that made our rental payments come down, which means we're paying off more of our mortgage over time. And I think we've got a better interest rate as well. So win-win all round. The kind of negative side of it, which we still don't really know the kind of repercussions of, is that when we come to sell, as I mentioned, it might be difficult for us to sell that 60%. If we offer that back to the housing association and they buy it, fantastic, but it goes onto the open market, the kind of pool of people willing or are able to afford a 60% share in a property, as we know, shared ownership is for first-time buyers, may be very small. So we still don't know if it was the right decision. When we come to sell, we will know. But essentially, we might staircase to 100%. In that case, it doesn't really matter. I guess we'll find out when it comes to us actually selling and moving on if it was the right decision. But essentially, we're both very comfortable with shared ownership. As I said, we're building up our equity in the property. And let's also consider if house prices increase, fingers crossed. We bought it at obviously a lower price, hopefully over time, that will increase, and our share in the property will increase as well. So potentially some money to be made. But yeah, stay tuned on kind of our exit strategy, which brings me on nicely to kind of my next point is around having a exit strategy in mind. And that would be my advice to my younger self when venturing into shared ownership. So just knowing whether you're the time period of how long you're expected to be in the shared ownership. Are you going to staircase to 100% and own the property outright, or are you going to stay at the share price which you actually purchase? Having those kind of questions in mind before you actually start can save you a lot of money in the long run. So to conclude the video, I would say shared ownership for us at the time, for our personal circumstance, for the money that we had available, was in fact the right opportunity for us. It allowed us to kind of build our equity over time and not waste our money renting, paying someone else's mortgage. As we mentioned, it's dead money renting, in my opinion. Also, we're in a brand new flat. It's a lovely flat, a great location in Zone 3 in London. For the money that we're paying, it goes a very, very long way. With that being said, if I didn't live in London, then shared ownership would not be my ideal route. I would look to kind of save as much as possible and buy a property outright, because we know that properties in London are very expensive, and as you go further up north, further back home in Nottingham, houses are much more affordable. With that being said, if my circumstances were completely different and I was living back home outside of London, the advice that I would give to my younger self as a first-time buyer is buy your own property, affordable property back home, and then rent out the individual rooms which you're not living in to friends who are essentially paying off your mortgage and allowing you to kind of generate that cash flow for you to increase your savings to then go and buy other property investment opportunities. Essentially a HMO kind of style strategy. So that's my advice if I were to do it all over again, but that's not to say that shared ownership wasn't the right opportunity for me at the time.